That was real. All right, so I'm going to start the introduction, and it'll back up just briefly to, I guess I'll start here. In fall 2019, Making a Seat at the Table, Women Transform Woodworking, featuring 47 innovative and diverse original works by 43 women and gender nonconforming persons from 19 of the United States, 2 Canadian provinces, and Australia. The show was timed to coincide with the centennial celebration of the 19th Amendment that granted but didn't yet guarantee women the right to vote in the United States. CAW Artistic Director Jennifer Nava-Milliken had invited Laura Mays, woodworker and director of the Krenov School at Mendocino College, and me, a longtime woodworker, curator, and arts educator in San Francisco, to translate the work originally conceived as a book into an exhibition. Never before had a survey exhibition of contemporary women woodworkers been mounted with so broad a reach. In 2011, the exhibition Furniture Divas at the Fuller Craft Museum in Massachusetts included the work of 15 women makers, not all woodworkers, and prior to that, the most recent exhibition of women in woodworking was in the 1980s. We put out a call for submissions and invited Milliken and woodworker designers Cheryl R. Riley and Tom Loser to jury the selection with us. To keep it manageable and focused, we decided to show contemporary makers whose work, while diverse in concept, material, and approach, has roots in the furniture tradition rather than the related fields of carving, turning, or carpentry and trades work. It was an exciting opportunity to assemble in one space both iconic works by artists whom we greatly admired and new works by emerging and mid-career makers who together addressed a broad range of conceptual and material questions. The first question we asked ourselves in this process was why, in the second decade of the 21st century, is it necessary to highlight gender while examining a decidedly genderless art form and medium? Despite a full 50 years of significant creative output by women makers and centuries of history in woodshops throughout the world, there simply has not been commensurate attention granted and credit given to the contributions of women woodworkers. Women and gender nonconforming woodworkers are still largely invisible on bookshelves and in woodworking magazines. Thus, we sought to illuminate that history and examine the breadth and richness of practices engaged by these makers so that the work can ultimately speak for itself. As exhibiting maker Laura Kishimoto would recently attest, it remains necessary and vital to recognize and acknowledge the realities women and gender nonconforming makers continue to face in the field, and to never assume that the work is done. This is Laura Kishimoto. Making a Seat at the Table remains the most significant and emotionally gratifying show I have participated in. It made me realize how powerfully being a woman in woodworking has shaped my identity. When I first began woodworking professionally in Ireland, I felt so isolated and discouraged. All of my coworkers were older men and considerably more experienced. One sexually assaulted me multiple times, but now being a woman in woodworking is a source of empowerment and community to me. Thank you very much for telling our stories. So I want to touch on why I didn't name the book Making a Seat at the Table. Because that was what we originally imagined. Not that it would ever be a catalog of the exhibition, but that it was sort of part of the same thread of expanding the field, throwing the shop doors open. And in discussing it, so Laura ultimately had to drop out of the project at the beginning of COVID, and so I brought in a longtime collaborator and thought partner, Carla Williams, who became my editor, and she really brought to my attention that language already felt too old, actually. That we're not seeking a seat at the table of someone else's design. That this is really a whole way of transforming this field of practice, and so that felt too small a vision. So that was ultimately why the book is called Joinery, Joists, and Gender.
Do you mind also going into a little bit about the decision to focus the work, which you just mentioned here, one paragraph ahead of that?
Yeah.
Focus the examination on furniture workmanship specifically, because I think there was a little bit of, I don't want to say controversy, but some discussions around that. And for me personally, it took me a while before it kind of sank in. Some discussions with Laura were required before I was like, oh, you mean
what did Laura say?
Are out.
Or do you remember what your takeaway was, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, because I needed it to be explained, but in different angles. I don't think there was any one conversation. It was multiple conversations for sure.
Right.
Until it finally became sharp and clear to me.
Right.
What we were looking at.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, actually, and I would say that you could look at any one of these makers and be like, well, you know. Some are more clearly reside in the furniture tradition. Partly it was Laura and my background, right? And so it was a place of some expertise or personal history that we felt like we could really do justice to. And partly along the lines of doing justice, it was a question of like, how do we create a container that can be held in a single book? And so I would also say it's very, with a couple exceptions in who we spoke to, it's really focused on the history in Western Europe and North America. So that is also want to be transparent about it's the scope that we could hold. And I think, you know, when I sort of fantasize about my next book, and one possibility is taking a more global approach. And there isn't a lot of material history that I know of. But again, so much of our material history has been circumscribed by a Western European relationship to the arts and crafts movement, that it could be that, you know, I was thinking about, well, what are we missing? So that was, you know, so there are blurry lines. I worked, you know, in my 20s, I worked as a carpenter on residential remodeling sites. And so in the history, I do look at the ways that women were moving into the wood shop and claiming space and claiming agency to make their physical, the structures of their physical environment. So they're not easy lines, but it did feel like that was a place that we could root into, and also do talk about the Cincinnati art carvers, because historically that has been an area that women had more access to. And then it was a question really of, you know, I think in a kind of conventional framework, there was some thought in the way that's often written, the Cincinnati art carvers, which was this extraordinary movement at the end of the 19th century, it lasted for 50 years, that the men made the structures and the women were allowed to do the carving. Well, in fact, what made that furniture unique, what made that furniture what it is the carving, right? So it also is for me as a researcher, as someone attempting to write about history, it's also always an undoing of what we've been told about what our values are, right? Right, that we think somehow the structural work is more important. Well, it's the carving that made that work just extraordinary. So, yeah, any other questions before I carry on? Did you have more? Did that?
No, except when it came to the Turners, there was a substantial body of women.
Absolutely.
Who had very specific experiences, and so they were a little bit up in arms. And of course, I could just hand those complaints out to Laura, who then took care of it.
Right. No, I mean, again.
Dramatically, but right. There was some resentment.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And I think those lines tend to be arbitrary in some sense. I mean, they are and they're not. I love turning myself personally, and it has its own historical trajectory. And so it deserves its own book.
Well, that was Laura. That was one of Laura's points in the end. The other is that when you look at recognition of
Turners.
Women, when you start to separate the fields, you look at the way that whether or not women have been respected or their work has been respected and written into the development of the history of the development of the field. Wood turning is a separate conversation. Even artistic wood turning is a separate conversation than what we were dealing with here. So it was that made sense to me.
Yeah, no, and I would say that still, feels quite true. It does deserve its own story, and there are histories that I don't yet know. I have to research. So, any other thoughts or questions? Things that you're responding to? Okay. From the outset, we grappled with the use of the terms woman and women to frame this project. 2 decades into the 21st century, as queer and trans activists continue the liberatory work of disrupting the gender binary and expand the boundaries of our understanding, We are conscious of honoring self-identity without positioning it as a foil to other descriptors. K.G. McKinnon, for example, who identifies as queer and trans, is profiled in this book. They didn't respond to the open call for making a seat at the table because they did not see themselves included within that framework. Likewise, Sean Desiree, also profiled here, identifies as non-binary. But we spoke with makers, including those who identify as women or sexed male at birth. But as we spoke with makers, their stories and reflections further illuminated the role of sex and gender expression in the woodshop, and it was essential that we included those makers in this survey. It's the wood that makes it good was it's really a gift from Carla, actually, and I put it in here as a nod to. The second question, which we did not expect, was perhaps because it seemed too obvious, is what do we mean by wood? And then I'm going to jump ahead, but beyond the cell structure or biology of the plant, there's the cultural significance of wood. More than any other single material we use, for most communities around the world, wood is the literal foundation of home, both its structure and its furnishings. We cleave, carve, and join wood to make the world habitable, to create the objects that make it possible, for example, to sit down for a meal with friends and family around a table, or to make a room that is safe and comfortable in which to sleep. The spatial organization and relative scales of furnishings can invite and constrain, blur boundaries, suggest intimacies, or determine and reinforce relations of power. Objects and structures illuminate the world of fabrication, shedding light on the maker and the means of production. While factory manufacturing models divide the production process into small-scale component parts on an assembly line, we fundamentally understand the integral relationship between the craftsperson and the work. When we consider woodworking, we also take a deep dive into the implications of resource consumption. There are no simple answers to the questions of sustainability, as we humans, a species with outsized impact relative to our biomass, use and exploit this plant material with ratios of strength to weight and workability that make it irreplaceably useful. Trees not only provide us with the means to material objects, to build structures, but also to heat and to cook, one of the few things that distinguishes us from other species. It completely changes our ability to extract nutrients from the food, thus making it possible to support our energy-consuming brains. Most importantly of all, trees provide us oxygen necessary for life. As a gateway to habitation and domesticity, woodworking is also a portal through which to view the world. Furniture is its manifestation, as symbolic as it is utilitarian, and woodworking forms a web of interconnectivity so deeply embedded in our collective consciousness that nature and culture are virtually indistinguishable. It can convey history and the present, access and welcome, wealth and power. It can also reveal a narrative rooted in geography, climate, and migration, or provide an entryway into ideas about agency and the agent. Now, craft is a place where the individual maker interacts with systems, whether technological, material, or economic. The body of the craftsperson is afforded mastery of the machine, and their labor is valued outside the imperatives of late capitalism. If mass production divides fabrication of goods into small-scale interchangeable component parts, each separate from the next and from the maker, and even from the end user, then the craftsperson creates a web of interconnection in creating form and satisfying a functional need. This craftsperson at their bench, we imagine, signifies the integral relationship between the maker and their materials as an entryway into conversation about place, rootedness, and the movement of global capital and material goods across this shared planet. So I then go on to talk about, when we first talked about this book, our primary research was rooted in interviews. And Laura Phoebe Kuo and I traveled around the country and we interviewed 40 different makers. Not most of those interviews we did together. Some of them we didn't, and some of them, when it was just me, I did in the COVID era and did on Zoom. But for the most part, we tried to meet people in their shop to see the kind of material universe. And we imagined that that's what the book would be. And we've been talking about a sort of a genre of contemporary book that is profiles of contemporary makers across different media. And the surprise was, and this was the first talk you heard, that was my initial foray into the history of women in the woodshop. The surprise was really how rich the history is, and that I felt like we couldn't talk about the present without really illuminating the history. And in fact, the defining questions of the history research remain the same today about economies and about sustainability, about community. and about the construction of gender. I would say they're very much the same thing that makers encounter today. So, so this next section kind of goes a little bit into our research methodology and the way the book is organized. And it's organized chronologically, broadly speaking, but it also is thematically organized, because in a given century or a given period of time, thank you so much, we're also talking about a phenomenon. So in the 20th century, we're really talking about education and how education shaped who had access to the woodshop. And this also, no doubt, betrays my own bias as an educator, because I think about how we educate all the time, and how we educate for liberation. And our vocational educational model was not a model for liberation. It was really a model that reified sex, gender, and constructs of ethnicity and race and class in America. So, and it was through the art studio door that most of the women who have entered woodworking come into the field. So, any questions, thoughts?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You were saying that you kind of transitioned the book from more women-focused to more inclusive as you were kind of putting it together, mostly seemingly based on the contemporary profile of the people that you were speaking to. Did you come across any history around LGBT woodworkers or across other races as well in the history of it?
So I want to make sure that I take apart all the. So it's not that it was part of our conversations about the exhibition too, when we had because the full title of the exhibition was Making a Seat at the Table: Women Transform Woodworking. And so it was, we were quite aware of, we're both queer identified, Laura and myself. We were very much aware of the limits of that, of the title. And it also felt like there was a thing that the exhibition was saying, or that this was staking a ground for, that hadn't been done, that was more often through women-identified makers, which was not at the exclusion. There were gender non-conforming makers in the exhibition. And so in our conversations about it, it was included, but we were aware of the problems of the title from the outset. The book was also from the outset gender inclusive. And it was really grappling with the trouble of the language that led me to change the title of it. There is certainly, historically, because of the ways that we're conceiving of gender and sex in the present are so much don't have a. We are talking about it in public discourse and in academic discourse in ways that we haven't historically. That I didn't find much in the historical record about gender nonconforming identified makers. There was absolutely a diversity of ethnicities represented in the historical record, and I think invites much more. And I think that's really largely around our constructs of craft and what we name craft, right? And so this is an area, like there's a long history in the HBCUs and that I was really excited to learn about, and I do talk about in the history section, of an embrace of Ruskin's ideas in the arts and crafts movement, but from a different social construct, right? It was really about reclamation post the dehumanization of enslavement, of slavery, right? And so it was of course, that's also tied to industrialization, but was rooted in this particularly dehumanizing history. Does that answer your question? So there's more work to be done is also part of what I want to say and where I would like to go in my own research, because if we talk about the world of cooking, men are understood to be chefs typically, and women make the majority of meals, right? And making home is conscribed to certain, like some people are doing craft and they're doing exactly the same thing as some people who are homemaking, right? Or doing domestic labor. And so I think there's much more to learn about the physical, our material history, and thinking about who made it and how we understand making home And that feels like layers of deepening discourse and a kind of liberating of our histories. I've just been talking to a woman at the Center for Craft who was looking, also interested in, she was interested in textile history in the northern slave states. And the history that she's looking at, because white women were quilting and that was craft, and black women were making home and they were enslaved, she was looking at how it's written into the historical record in slave exchange, the purchase of slaves, enslaved people, right? And so it's just like we're still like learning to tell new histories and learning where that history is hidden, is buried, and what we name craft. Does that?
Yeah, that's very enlightening to hear about how changing the kind of terminology can help you uncover some of those stories. But I was mostly just curious about, like, obviously a lot of these historical women are often, that history is kind of either erased or not emphasized, and I wondered if there was also diversity within that.
It was definitely part of the thing I was holding in writing the history and in trying to, it was also, it's my learning. I'm not a historian. I'm, an art curator and a photo, a teacher. And this emerged out of this conversation Laura and I had, where I took a year off and I went to woodworking school. And I have been woodworking since my early 20s, but I dove into the Krenov School. And at Thanksgiving, I asked Laura what it was like to be a woman in a male-dominated field. And I come out of women's education, and it seemed like just making conversation really is what it seemed like.
Here we are.
And here we are 5 years later, because her initial response was that she didn't want to talk about it, and she wasn't alone in that. We had we kept talking about it, and later that spring we had 12 or 13 women into the wood shop, all women identified makers at the time, and many of them felt uncomfortable with being called women woodworkers. But they all had stories to tell. But it was also, and I touch on this in the introduction, it was a very conscious choice to not emphasize narratives of sexism or discrimination in the woodshop, because we all know those stories, right? I mean, like I was in a talk recently. It was Furniture Society, and we were talking about strategies to open the shop doors wide for any maker. And this educator, I forget where she's teaching, but she talked about the men in her class, and she said, she described the information that they provided her as supplemental information. And I don't know if any of you have experience with this, but I have taught woodworking, and I will sometimes have men in the class add on or offer answers when the question has been directed to me. And sometimes the information is incorrect, is perhaps unsafe. But I loved that she called it supplemental information. I was like, that is the kindest terminology I have ever heard. So, but it felt also really important to not dwell in there, because that to not shape the accomplishments of these remarkable makers through the lens of discrimination. And so, except where a maker described a particular scenario that was necessary for the telling of their story, I left those out. So, any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
My apologies of coming to this having not read the book.
Oh my God, no, I think you're not alone.
So you said as you were like traveling around the country, so are there stories within like the voids of the country where there was no one to talk to? Like, is that?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Were there voids? I mean, I think one of the really interesting things to come out of the exhibition, and I'm going to answer your question sideways, is that people felt a remarkable sense of community. And I have been curating exhibitions for 12 years now, and I had never experienced a show that felt like this. you know, so there were 43 makers represented, and the ways that people reached out to support other makers, to help, you know, transport their pieces from, you know, we used, it was a, yeah.
The arrival of every piece into the center was like
Like
a and sometimes a reunion between people.
Across generations, across teachers and students, and what I think it was making this community visible to itself. And so there are lots of places in the country where somebody's the only woman in their area, the only woman they know of, the only woman or gender nonconforming maker, or maybe they, you know, and certainly the web has eased that, but in a geographic sort of, you know, tactile relational way, it's not quite the same. And so we didn't get to every state. There was, you know, a handful in the Indianapolis area, and there were, you know, certainly a lot on the Eastern Seaboard and more in California and Oregon. So I'm sure that there were gaps, and I'm sure there's more work to be done. When we put out a call for the exhibition, we were stunned by the number of entries.
So how many applications did you get?
Well over 150.
Yeah.
Well over 150. We invited 13 or 14, something like that, and you know, it brought in 30 more, but we were stunned.
Yeah. And not.
Right. I mean, yeah, like we didn't expect it, and it was like, oh my gosh, this sort of flourishing of work, and it was, you know, a really wide range of work, and it was extraordinary. But I think there's still a sense of making visible to ourselves. Yeah.
I want to go back to when you picked the title for the exhibition. Was it deliberate to not use binary or something more inclusive in the title? Or is it that when you got the applications in, you realized it was a much...
You mean in the exhibition?
Right, in the exhibition.
We did talk about changing it, and I can't remember exactly, you know, it was several years ago now, and I can't remember exactly why we stuck it out, even acknowledging the problems of it. I don't know if you remember.
Well, there were so many titles before making a seat at the table.
We did bring that to our jury.
That was pretty late in the planning stages. It was for a long time. It was women's work, and then there were so many different.
We did play with that for a while. Now that you're.
It was a source of discussion for a long time between the two of you, and I was.
And then, I think then we ultimately brought it to the jury, which was Nava and Tom and Cheryl.
I think, well, and we were all kind of seduced by the double entendre of seats and tables.
Right. I mean,
I think I speak for myself, that really piqued my imagination in a lot of different ways.
But then there's a core of artists who then felt like they couldn't take.
Well, I only know of one. Okay. I only know of one, and in the language that we used, the supplemental language.
That's the one that's mentioned in the introduction.
Yeah. K.G. McKinnon chose not to, and you know, they were in our interview process. We talked really at length about their evolving gender identity through time and from the beginning of their work as a woodworker, and so that's very much embedded in their story. And yeah, I mean, so I think in our supplemental information we made clear that it was gender inclusive, but that you know, it also, I would say that that's
in all of the descriptions, or I don't know, more detailed text and interpretive materials that were around the exhibition, including what was shared with the press.
Yeah,
it was this wider, more inclusive language.
And the press kind of picked that up.
And mostly, and mostly we called it making a seat at the table.
Yeah. Actually, so that's very sweet. and one, I can think of one specifically because it was like such a personal exchange. It was Glenn Adamson who was writing a broader piece about women. I don't even remember what it was anymore, what it was for. But he was writing an essay about women in craft or something, and he asked me for a quote about this show specifically, and so I gave him one that included broader language, and then he included the quote, but then expounded on that and pointed that out, that I had used
Gender-inclusive language.
gender-inclusive language, and then made a point out of that.
Right. Yep. Any other questions? That's a good question. It's definitely a wrestling match, linguistically. Yeah. Okay. Any questions about process, or? I will read. I'll start with Katie Hudnall, and people have juice for it. Then I'll read Wendy Mariama. Okay. Okay. We are on page 207. For those of you following along in the text. Katie Hudnall, practice makes imperfect. This opens with a quote. I've realized that my way of making connections and figuring things out and moving through the world has its own kind of successful outcomes, but they don't look a thing like other people's. Katie Hudnall lives on a quiet, leafy street in Indianapolis in a scene so quintessentially Middle American that it stands in stark relief to her work, which is anything but. A house is set back on a green lawn, sloping slightly away from the house. Everything is symmetrical. A straight path leads to a quaint early 1910s craftsman house. There's something reminiscent of Tim Burton or Pee Wee Herman about the whole scenario. Inside Hudnall's house, there are collections of things: acorns, shells, pens, cookbooks, arranged on shelves and on the windowsills. Against one wall is Spirit's cabinet, functioning like conventional furniture, filled with stacks of plates and bowls. Despite its unconventional nature, one door opens upward, and viewed end on, it's essentially a see-through cabinet. It fits well in the tidy, warm room. Like many artists, Hudnall is inspired by and uses reclaimed materials in her work. Spirit's cabinet includes a piece of reclaimed work from every place she had lived until its making. And so, though she sells most of her work, this one is personal and not for sale. There are no tricky woodworking joints. Instead, she most often uses cold connections: screws, cotter pins, rivets, nuts, and bolts, which become a visual and material element in work that is witty, often obsessive, and sometimes outright hilarious. Hudnall's pieces are true contraptions created where Rube Goldberg met the falling down barn in a wheat field. As much as being furniture, Hudnall's work alludes to furniture, which she calls furniture-ish. These might be floor cabinets designed to contain, but whose capacity for holding is so particular to a singular object as to verge on the absurd. Like your grandmother's drawer labeled strings too short to use, Hudnall built a storage cabinet for screws that had failed to have the slots milled during manufacturing, and a beautiful magnifying display box for a wing nut, playfully illuminating the human-made objects created to provide for very particular human needs. In another instance, it's a lamp poised like a spider ready to pounce, or a wall cabinet that invites the user to peer through a porthole at the contents, which seem to peer right back. These are furniture works that invite us into a set of unexpected relationships. The ways we think of opening and closing a cabinet door or putting stuff away are taken to logical yet unexpected conclusions. Hudnall's work resides in a world where we live with our furniture, where the side table might not stand complacently at the end of the couch. Born in 1979, Hudnall grew up in the 80s in suburban Washington, D.C. Slow to read, she was placed in classes for students with learning differences. With testing, it emerged that the issue was how she sees. Both literally, she's nearly legally blind, and perceptually. When asked in vision exams which way the letter was pointing, she would respond, "What do you mean, pointing?" Glasses helped enormously, as did her supportive parents. Like many kids, Hudnall enjoyed playing soccer, biking, and walking around the neighborhood up and down the Potomac River near their home. The rest of the time, she drew anything that would sit still long enough. She paid particular attention to small things, perhaps because she couldn't see the big ones. I had no idea there were leaves on trees you could really see until I was 10. As a teenager, Hudnall attended Catholic school, but there was no soccer, and she found the uniforms restrictive and her grades plummeted. She found sanctuary in the theater club and the art room, which felt to Hudnall the only subversive space in the school. She became part of the stage crew and learned to make things, building sets badly. When it came time to think about college, Her dad suggested art schools. She chose Corcoran College of Art and Design in Washington, D.C., not far from home, but far enough. Hudnall quickly realized that there were people there better at drawing in a technical representational sense, so she gravitated toward sculpture. I certainly wasn't the student that anybody thought was still going to be making work 20 years later, because most of my cohorts aren't now, she reflects. There's a couple of us, but very few. I learned that making good work has a lot less to do with natural talent than with practice. So I was thinking as I read that maybe reading the whole thing is not necessarily the best approach, but I'd be happy to. I love being read out loud too. But I also wanted to reflect back some of the feedback that I've gotten from makers, which has been very moving. An opportunity to talk with them about the experience of being interviewed, these were 2.5 or 3 hour interviews, if not longer, and sometimes came back for more. And I think that they all felt surprised by the breadth of the interviews, that we were really interested in how they arrived at woodworking in all the unconventional ways. What are the things in childhood that informed their creativity, informed their sense of materials in the world? So that was fun to hear back. And it's been, for me, the most moving feedback has been people who feel well represented. That feels.
I was going to say, I've known Katie for a while, and I have never heard that side of her experience as a child, not being able to see. And
Right.
And it explains so much
Right,
about
it
her
does.
drawings and sort of micro view of things.
Her kind of wondrous, silly, very perceptive. Yeah.
How'd you make your selection of the people that are profiled in here? Was it from the show or separate to that?
Some of the people were in the show. It's a great question, and one that there are always, I think, difficult decisions about. In the selection process, I was very interested in making visible multiple pathways, making visible multiple generations, multiple ways of making in the present, multiple histories, and multiple ethnicities. So I was really interested in making visible the pluralism of the practice, which feels like we have told a very narrow story historically about what woodworking looks like, and about individuality, and it doesn't look like that. And I think it's important to bake that into our stories. Yeah. And there are people who, could easily be in another volume, and, yeah, they're good stories to tell. Yeah, other questions? Hey. Okay, I'm just, if one wanted to.
Katie's also got such an extraordinary spatial sense. And I'm still thinking about her vision.
Yeah.
Because,
Right.
I don't know if you feel like other musician friend who's losing her vision. And she said when she could read sheet music less and less,
Yeah.
she at the same time got a better grasp of the shape of the piece she was playing, which I'd never thought about before. That there's
Right.
this kind of
But of course,
structure to it that
yeah.
you might not see if you're just looking at the notes.
Right. The vision and perception, though, are, yeah. But you're relying on other senses, and I like the idea that the structure becomes visible in quotes when you can't see the details. Yeah.
You had mentioned that you did some of your interviews on Zoom, mostly during the pandemic. Do you, and it's hard because you probably had interviewed them before, but do you find that people were more do you think that helped in a way, or that hindered? Were people more reflective, depending on what part of the pandemic?
So Alison Crony Moses is the one who comes to mind first. I had reached out to her in pre-pandemic times. Let's say PPT or something. And she had a new baby. And so, expressed interest, but, wasn't able to email back. And I thought, of course, I have nothing but compassion and love and respect for parents. Yeah, I know exactly. And then I attended a talk at the Elliott School where she's the assistant director, and she was facilitating it. it was a couple of years later. It was, a year, maybe a couple months into the pandemic. And I wrote to her again, and I said, we've been in touch, and and I think that there's a way that the structure of her work in pandemic times made it possible for her to, open up, and her baby was a little bit older, and I think what she would say, I think, is that it's still, I don't know that she would say that she was more reflective, but to your point, I think, of course, the quality of the interview is always informed by a particular moment. I mean, Katie talked about some, having been sober for a period of time at that point, and kind of experiencing the, I thought throughout that there's a kind of, that all of us want the opportunity to tell our stories, right? And to have somebody or a group of people come and sit at your table for 3 hours and just be interested in you is, both sort of horrifying to me personally, but also amazing, right? And I think that was reflected back to me in these conversations, that they felt the vulnerability, the interest, all of the things that come with that kind of reflection. Yeah, and that they reflected and connected things that they hadn't before. Yeah. So, it's a little after 7. How are we doing? Shall I keep reading, or should we? Okay. Okay.
We're all wrapped.
I tell my students, I'm a terrible mind reader. So give me some kind of sign. Yeah, I know. I know. Particularly when I was teaching on Zoom, I'm like, come on, give me something. Help me out, because I really can't. Okay. Growing up, Hudnall had loved going to the Museum of Natural History, fascinated by the drawers of rocks and shelves. And in the mundane realm of the trip to the post office, she found an affinity with the walls of tiny doors, each representing a person. For her final project at Corcoran, Hudnall built a head-shaped cabinet with compartments inside, which she envisioned as the material manifestation of the inside of her brain. Doors opening and closing, hiding and revealing, and perhaps presaging the future direction of her work. Upon graduation, Hudnall accompanied her girlfriend to Spain. They landed on September 11, 2001. Unable to speak Spanish, for those next few months, Hudnall wandered Valencia in the company of Sheepy, a sheep who lived on the pages of her sketchbook, and Fred, another character who reminded her to stay out of trouble. She even made a pilgrimage to Scotland to see the work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, with whom she was obsessed. Tall, skinny, uncomfortable chairs. I thought they were the bee's knees. Hudnall moved back to Oberlin, Ohio, where she became increasingly interested in resuming the nascent woodworking she had begun as an undergraduate. She found work with Pally Davis, a sculptor, and her husband, Michael Holubar, a specialist in Frank Lloyd Wright furniture. They taught her some basic woodworking skills and urged her to think about graduate school. Using recycled pallet wood stitched together with copper wire, Hudnall created a portfolio and applied to Virginia Commonwealth University. She got in. At VCU, Hudnall was one of 2 woodworking students. While she was trying to make dovetailed carcasses and more traditional formal furniture, her notebooks were filled with weird furniture that's walking around. All of her professors encouraged her to create the work that animated the pages of her sketchbook, but it was Susan Iverson, a textiles professor, who phrased it most succinctly. Where's the humor in this work, and where's the line quality? Why do you keep trying to make stuff the way other woodworkers make stuff? You draw stuff this way, why don't you make it the way you draw it, not the way you see other people doing it? It's difficult to imagine Hudnall's work not always being what it is now, a world of its own with a self-contained absurdist logic. With permission and encouragement, she realized she could be her own kind of woodworker. Once she was introduced to cold connections, Hudnall realized with relief that she could transfer this technology of fasteners to wood. The first piece Hudnall made following this revelation was the 4-legged The Pirate Stool, which has a peg leg that can be swapped out, dressed up or down. For her MFA thesis project, Hudnall invented a character and then constructed their environment. The mad tinkerer, essentially Hudnall herself, or the scientist maker she hoped to be, and her tools. A chessboard and table rotated on 4 wheels so the tinkerer could play against herself. When the viewer approaches, the game would be half played. And then I made stairs going up to the window and covered the window with a door so it looked like a way out. And I put in a fake floor that made all these crazy sounds when you walked into it. There was a little woodworking bench and drawings all over the walls and these weird rafter things that I just sketched in space. The installation was, Hudnall describes, like walking into an illustration. That was the idea. And there was more. The door at the top of the stairs had a door cut in it, and that door had a little door cut in it, and again until the last door had a window. Hudnall had created a micro-world for her work. Where you see text that's bolded, those terms reside in an illustrated glossary. And I chose to do the illustrated glossary because back in the 70s, there were a few books for women interested in building their own homes. And there were many fewer building codes, and land was cheaper, and there was a kind of women's back to land moment and movement. And a few women who had written these books. And part of, it felt like a very important part of decoupling the craft from the language of it in a way that can be, the language can be a language of exclusion, was to draw really accessible drawings. And so this is a riff on, this is a reflection back on that practice, which felt so inviting. And Christy Williams, who herself is a woodworker, did these drawings. She did them, just a beautiful job. Hudnall has not continued to make installations, partly because of space constraints, but largely because she realized a piece creates its own context, the terms on which it can be encountered. I figured out that when you make an object, it has to be good no matter how far you zoom in, and that was something that the installation taught me, that detail should be as good, if not better, than the piece from far away. This is one of the remarkable aspects of her work, the confidence of its internal logic. On leaving VCU in 2005, Hudnall moved to Bumpus, Virginia, 40-odd miles northwest of Richmond, where she lived with her then partner on their family farm. All around them was rural infrastructure built and repaired by the previous 7 generations, utilitarian buildings informed by function and expediency, and an aesthetic integrity fueled by rationality and utility. Though by the time Hudnall moved to the farm, the buildings were mostly falling in, the experience proved quite formative. Being able to see all the solutions, all of the ways that the doors closed with just a pivoting latch, it was really beautiful. You can follow the logic of how everything's made. It was a busy and productive period. Hudnall was making a lot of work, exhibiting as much as possible, teaching adjunct at VCU for 1 semester per year, and working in commercial cabinet shops. She was learning speed and efficiency at the commercial shops, developing a pedagogical style, and consolidating her aesthetic. In 2008, she was awarded an $8,000 scholarship from Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, which was not only a boost to her confidence, but allowed her to build a website and pay for professional images of her work, both of which increased her visibility. After a residency at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and another at Anderson Ranch in Colorado, Hudnall applied to a full-time teaching position at Murray State in Kentucky, where the department was looking for someone to talk with equal ease to the students drawn to sculpture and those attracted to woodworking. She was the right candidate at the right time. Both the academic politics and Kentucky itself came as something of a culture shock. Hudnall was the only openly gay faculty member in a conservative Christian town, to which she responded by growing a mohawk. But she describes the department as a good introduction to teaching. Other faculty were gentle with her, easing her in slowly, and she enjoyed her students. After 3 years, she decided it was time to move on and landed a position as Associate Professor of Furniture Design in Herron School of Art and Design in Indiana University in 2013, and was there until the beginning of academic year 2021, when she moved to the University of Wisconsin at Madison to lead their woodworking program. An early riser who is drawn to the quiet, the solitude, and the lack of social media, Hudnall often spends those early morning hours sketching. In fact, she sketches a lot, and not furniture per se, using the medium instead as a way to store, process, and discover her thoughts and impressions, whether she's at a faculty meeting or taking a line for a walk. The drawings resemble her furniture in line quality and humor, but not as representations for a particular piece or plan of action. Hudnall is introspective and self-reflective, and there's a playful and sophisticated blend of the ordinary and extraordinary in her way of being in the world. And in her work, which is unusual, heterogeneous, and recognizably hers, with reference to contemporary art history. Hudnall's work privileges line quality over form or mass. In some cases, the work appears relatively delicate, almost fragile, and because of its accretional nature, she simply adds more linear elements until the structure is strong enough. In other words, the apparent lightness of line weight has more in common with the logic of a suspension bridge, a complex array of components carrying weight that defies expectation. Her favorite illustrators, Edward Gorey, Quentin Blake, and Shel Silverstein, are all darkly funny. She's particularly drawn to Gorey for the intensity of the detail. Edward Gorey's people would be in a room that's got wallpaper and he's drawn the fucking wallpaper. It's amazing, she marvels. Hudnall is particular about specifics of a line. She doesn't just use the pen or pencil that happens to be in her hand, instead choosing the rather fussy and sometimes messy technology of refillable drafting pens. Hudnall attends to her workspace with the same deliberate consideration, constantly resetting or knolling it. Her use of cold fasteners means that she has literally hundreds of connectors to organize in her shop, a fact that seems to fill her with joy. She refers to organizational structure as the exoskeleton which keeps her brain on track, a concept and approach she tries to communicate to her students. They leave their benches a total mess, and I constantly reorganize mine and clean. I call it resetting. I'll constantly reset my space because I'm really scattered as a thinker, and if I don't have a structure around me, I'll be looking for my pencil for like 400 hours and never actually make anything. Her workshop is indeed tidy and organized and unusually animated, which in Hudnall's case means that inanimate objects have faces and sometimes names, and there are notes on the wall both to and from Hudnall. Some of Hudnall's students are drawn to her classes because they've seen things on Instagram that they want to make. But while they may start by wanting to replicate the resin table they saw, they're open to trying new things, Hudnall says, and they're getting more sculptural. Sculpture is about human skill, about things the size of furniture, things the size of something you can hold. It's about being human, whether it's new technology or traditions or something blended. Fine art sculpture feels like it's about fine art sculpture. You would have to understand the history of sculpture to understand it. I don't think you have to understand the history of craft to understand some of these sculptural craft pieces. You just have to have a body. Hudnall goes on to argue for the importance of the knowledge furniture makers bring of material, scale, and utility to creating sculptural work. Some of the most interesting sculpture is being made by furniture makers. Some of my colleagues in the sculpture department would be mad at me for saying that, but they are not here. She's also excited about fibers and ceramics, likewise materials best worked at human scale. The excitement Hudnall brings to her work in her classroom is infused too with deliberation and a patience for the learning process. Indeed, when asked for any advice she would give to a young woodworker, there are clearly lessons Hudnall has taken to heart. Your head will get you a lot further than your hands, and you have to be patient with yourself. You'll have ideas for things that you want to make that you're just not capable of making at first. Be patient and tenacious, and remember that so much of the world is made up of wood. Look at it, pay attention to it, because there's so many different ways to do things. And if it works, you've done it right. There's not one way to do stuff. That quote feels particularly like Katie, but it also feels so important because I think that in wood shops, we're often taught that there's one way to do it. And I think approaching it in a more expansive, pedagogical way is so liberating and inviting. And I think that it frees us from some of the tradition to experiment. Yeah. Thoughts or questions? I am also conscious of time. How are we doing? What should we do? Shall we read just a little bit of Wendy? All right. Well, Wendy is very funny, very irreverent. I was out at Nakashima Woodworkers yesterday and talking to Mira Nakashima, and I brought up Wendy, and she remarked on Wendy's profane use of language, which is one of the many joys of Wendy. All right, let's see where we'll... Okay, I'll read the first page and a half. For 4 decades, Wendy Maruyama has been at the forefront of and central to studio furniture. Woodworker, artist, educator, and advocate, Maruyama has consistently challenged boundaries as well as the preoccupations of both craft and concept that have at times defined the field. She helped usher in postmodernism, which became central to the momentum and aesthetics of the studio furniture movement, and through 3 more decades has continued to investigate its leading edge, always with accessible, connective vocabulary. Maruyama's work seeks to understand woodworking and furniture making in the context of domestic spaces and the social relations furniture suggests, prescribes, and sometimes constrains. It also demonstrates a profound curiosity and a deep capacity to engage wood as a material for the expression of or carrier for meaning. As an influential educator and mentor, Maruyama's impact has been felt nationally and will have ripples for generations. For decades, she headed up furniture design and woodworking at San Diego State University, one of the most prestigious and influential MFA furniture programs in the country, and has enjoyed shorter stints in several other renowned craft and woodworking programs. Her influence is felt across this book as she has touched the lives and creative practices of many of the voices who are shaping the craft of woodworking today. While continually exhibiting her work, Mariama has also volunteered for the organizations that are shaping and supporting this field. For many years, she was on the boards of the Furniture Society, Haystack Mountain School, and the American Craft Council, and is now working with Surf Plus and Greenwood Global. All are active, engaged boards, several of which support scholarships and plan conferences for educators and makers. Mariama is an advocate for diversity in programming and in the nomination of other board members, arguing that it matters who is in leadership positions. As gatekeepers, they shape what questions are being asked and what work is seen and valued. Because of the political climate, there's this real need to make sure that we're thinking globally and with diversity. Are we representing a wide enough group of people through publications and shows? Though Mariama does not theorize or intellectualize in conversation, her work has consistently explored complex issues outside of the craft's traditional purview. With characteristically self-effacing humor, Mariama opened our conversation stating, "I'm not a great woodworker." She's talking about technique. "Making a perfect joint doesn't come naturally to me. It's quite a struggle, actually. So I frustrate myself because you always measure yourself up with other woodworkers and think, oh, fuck." In fact, Mariama is perfectly capable of exemplary technique. While pursuing a 2-year program at Boston University, she made a compound curved blanket, chest in walnut, with sides that bulge out in both directions. The piece is remarkable in the complexity of its construction and execution, and was later featured in Fine Woodworking Biennial Design Book. Once she'd mastered technique, it wasn't long before she saw its limitations and the fun that could be poked at its pursuit. Technique only goes so far. The pursuit of technical perfection can become a holy grail, a distraction from the other work that furniture can do, the meaning it can hold. All right. Yeah, she's a goodie. What is a compound curve?
Well, I can see
It's in the glossary. Look at the picture, it'll describe it better than I can. A curve going in 2 directions at the same time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's not nothing. It's a little bit like the roof at Eschericks. It's compound curves. There's not a straight line in the place.
So steam bed?
It's one way of doing it. It's probably the easiest way of doing it. Yeah. Other questions? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if you think about anything we do as a metaphor for life,
Mm-hmm.
what have you learned through the process of writing this book that you think of as a metaphor for life?
That's so great, because certainly I think I describe this book as a social history of labor, of women and labor, or construction of gender and labor. Had Laura stayed on, it might have been a woodier book in many ways, because I'm more rooted in sociology and the arts. But what I found, I loved the writing of it. I loved the research for it, both the primary and the secondary research. And I think that the part that, my answer to your earlier question is the part that continues to be humbling and to be also like a call to action, which is that kind of continually deconstructing your own thought process, your own what you think you know and what we think we know, because the questions we ask are circumscribed by what is already written, right? And we have to ask new questions, right? Or we'll keep writing the same things, you know? So I think that is my learning, and it's sort of joyful.
Yeah, which fits in a way with what you said earlier, which was you didn't want this book to be about sexism in the woodshop.
Right.
Because that story's been written, even though there's so many more.
Well, it's not. It hasn't probably been written. It's just that we all know it.
Yeah.
And who wants to read it? You're like, oh yeah, that happened. Like, you know. Oh, again. Oh, there. You know.
But it's almost like you're talking about opening new ways of seeing the world, and in a way, even opening new doors that we didn't necessarily doors of perception that we didn't even know existed. Like this is a continual exploration of like human experience that's manifested by woodworking?
Well, I think, and maybe I'm just repeating what you're saying, but through slightly different, is that people have been doing this work through time. It's that we haven't named it, and we haven't looked at it or valued it or compared it to other things because of the qualifiers around which we named it. Or does that make sense? And so I don't feel like, I think that I get to put together stories that haven't been put together yet. I think that's what this book does.
Were
Yeah.
you the first person to do interviews on this scale?
With women,
Women in this, like,
we were. I feel like I can say that with a fair amount of certainty.
What did the interviews look like? Like, did you,
What do you mean?
Ask questions? Like, what was the framework of the interviews?
We had a long list of questions.
Did they get ahead of time?
They didn't get them ahead of time. That's so interesting. I mean, I want to add one thing about the process of the book, just from a research practices, is that I sent to every maker who's profiled, and every maker who not necessarily profiled in a chapter, but whose work is covered in depth, a list of direct quotes and a list of facts. And that was with two exceptions. Because I wanted to make sure, like, I couldn't possibly have have every maker respond to what I had written about them, or edit it on the basis of what I had said about them. I had to live with, like, that I would make mistakes, or that, you know, they may or may not like what I wrote about them. But I also really felt a strong responsibility to represent them well and fully. And by well, I don't mean that everything would be flowery or positive or whatever, but to really consider their work deeply and what they shared in the interview. So there were two exceptions to that, and one was K.G. McKinnon, and one was Roseanne Summerson. And in both of those cases, I sent them the whole chapter and invited their feedback. And with Roseanne, it was because she has lived a public enough life, and at that time she hadn't left RISD. And so I felt a responsibility to make sure that whatever was written about her in public was okay. KG, they were uncomfortable. There was enough riding on my representation of their gender identity that I wanted to be equally careful. And they sent back a lot of edits. I'm not sure the chapter is stronger for it, but it felt important that they have that power. They're not the only gender nonconforming maker, but they were the one for whom that held the most, that was most at issue, of how it was represented. So you asked, though, we did have a long script. They didn't get it in advance. We sat down, we often had tea. I wrote for the Furniture Society, I wrote about my day with Christina Madsen. It was just an absolute delight. I landed there after a snowstorm. I mean, it was a light snowstorm, but I'm from California. There was snow on the ground, I'll say, and there was still snow on the leaves. And, you know, we sat for the day in her kitchen, and so it was very kind of tactile, multi-sensory. You know, we walked out through the snow to her laundry was on the line in the, 20-degree temperature. It was great. It was very Christina Madsen. So it was often very much like that. It was just really sitting down with a cup of tea and, and people, I felt very moved by how open people were, how responsive and how much they trusted us, which I find remarkable. Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me. I think that is the tone of many, many conversations in the craft world. At least that's my happy experience working in this world, is that the conversations are candid, honest and warm, and that's what you read the bit on Katie. That comes through her personality, comes through so in sharp focus in this chapter, and I think that the nature of the conversation and the intimacy that was shared, it's coming through in the book. And that also makes it a different kind of book when you're telling a history.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I do think that's true. I want to say that I don't, it would have been difficult to imagine quite the same book being written about mail makers. And that's speculative, of course. But I don't know. I don't know if you feel that. Yeah.
I'm paid to say that regardless, but yes, I do.
I'm paid to say that. And I don't mean it as a criticism, I just mean it as cultural norms and kind of discursive, relational habits. Yeah.
I've been thinking of, since your talk last week with our racial equity and craft education group, been thinking a lot about that because as a graduate student, spending a lot of time thinking about the development of industrial design, there were certain methodologies that I became aware of in the sort of canonical books about industrial design in the 20th century. They were hero-focused. Forget about women being mentioned at all. Even Ray Eames was not a person at the forefront of the discussion of that studio and the influence that they had on design.
Right.
So I've been really interested to, now that I have the book in my hands. I did not have it last week.
It truly came like 2 days ago.
So I'm really
Yeah, maybe yesterday.
through some very fancy footwork on Katie's part.
Yes.
And so I'm really eager to see how that methodologically, how that might make an impact to carry on what you were saying earlier. I think that there will be an impact on the way histories are.
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I hope that it's an invitation to more research, to more books. And the feedback, I mean, and also it was important that I not try to put a nice tidy bow around this as the experience of women, because women's, all of our experiences are intersectional, and so I don't shy away from talking about class and racial identity and gender identity and all the ways that those experiences and histories, I'm trying to allow people to tell their own story.
The other thing that I loved that you said last week was, and I was a little bit late to the meeting, but so right when I popped in, you were saying this, and that was that somebody asked, were you feeling any anxiety about the book at any stage after you'd sort of released the manuscript? And you said that initially yes, but then you. Well, why don't you tell everyone?
Well, I went through, so the book came out in mid-March, and we've had some distribution issues, but it did come out in mid-March technically, and so for January, February, and the first part of March, I felt like so much in the world was falling apart, like I don't even need to go into all the things, even this week and the last 2 days, but I felt personally this great sense of wonder that this long labor of love and multiple years of work was going to be in the world, and I felt wonder and gratitude. And then I also felt like, oh my God, what if I got something wrong? Right? And like, this history has never been written before. What if I got something wrong? Oh shit! Really, I was like, did I check all my references? I'm going through in my head. I'm not a historian. I'm just making shit up. No, I'm not making shit up. But I felt all of that, like that kind of flush of, oh my God, what if I got something wrong? And it took me a few days of going through that before I realized, well, of course I got something wrong. And then we'll keep writing.
And that's a baton handing off to the next, and the next, and the next.
Yeah. So. Yeah.
Just why the cover? Why the picture?
People have mistakenly thought it's me. Yeah. It is not. I have a terrible vertical. I never had a good vertical. I did play basketball, but I never had this vertical. This is not me. It is Audie Culver of COC. And, you know, we played with a bunch of them. Actually, wanted to put one of Sean Desiree's works on the cover. They have done this really beautiful work that is reminiscent of quilting, but that is rooted in public housing in the Hudson, New York area. And it looked conventional. It looked like a woodworking book. And in conversation with Carla, actually, I did multiple book covers from, you know, and there's so much beautiful work in this book. It could have been any number of pieces. But what this did was it's very unconventional and it's very joyful. Yeah, and that's what it.
Look like your feet aren't going to come down in time to the tabletop. I hope she's a little alarming.
Yeah.
I believe that she's behind it entirely. She's behind it. Yeah.
Intentional that it's a seat at the table?
No, no.
It is a seat.
I know. We already,
It's
yeah.
echoing. It's a,
Yeah, I
it's
did.
like an
It's a very
homage.
quiet homage to the show. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for coming. It's a pleasure to talk with you about it.
Thank you for coming.